The member for Wills. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Ryan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak to this motion by the member for Fremantle, and I start by addressing the inaccuracies in the motion. Food Standards Australia and New Zealand do not require testing, as they do not set the testing regime. Food Standards identifies which foods and imports of foodstuffs are considered high risk, and then the Department of Agriculture determines the testing regime. Currently, and indeed previously under the Labor-Greens alliance government, those foods deemed high risk are subject to 100% inspection for 5 shipments, dropping to 25% for 20 shipments and then 5%. Unfortunately, berries were not identified as a high-risk item, but I believe that has already been appropriately addressed by the Minister for Agriculture, who has asked Food Standards Australia and New Zealand to reassess the risk associated with berries. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I cannot support this part of the motion, as it is not true. However, Mr Deputy Speaker, local growers are not required by the government to test for chemicals. As everyone knows, there are international standards for allowable limits of chemical residue from pesticides and fertilisers, so the testing that is done is a commercial imperative for growers to be able to ensure their product is fit for market. As for the rest of the motion, Mr Deputy Speaker, in 2011, I spoke in this place on this very issue. I spoke about consumers being well and truly tired of guessing where their food comes from. This report, the Blewett Report, commissioned by the Australia and New Zealand Food Regulation Ministerial Council and released on 28 January 2011, addressed many of the issues we're talking about today. For example, Mr Deputy Speaker, this motion at 1D states that labelling is confusing regarding country of origin labelling. Unlike points B and C of this motion, Mr Deputy Speaker, that is true. But why is it confusing? The Blewett Report at recommendations 40 and 41 out of 62 asks that country of origin laws be extended to include, and I quote, that for foods bearing some form of Australian claim, a consumer-friendly, food-specific country of origin labelling framework based primarily on the ingoing weight of the ingredients and components, excluding water, be developed. So 4 years ago, the ALP Greens de facto relationship had a chance to address the issue of food-specific country of origin labelling. Their response was they did not support either of the recommendations related to country of origin labelling because it was all a bit too hard. How often has that been the excuse of those opposite? Food labelling, a bit too hard? Stopping the boats, stopping deaths at sea and keeping children out of detention, a bit too hard? Responsibly managing the economy, a bit too hard. Fortunately for consumers, we now have a government which is not afraid of hard work and not afraid to make decisions in the national interest, in the interests of all Australians. As Minister Joyce said on 26th of February, people want to know exactly where their food comes from, and this is the government that is going to do it. And better labelling will be backed up by enhanced screening at the border. The coalition government is strong on border protection, and that means biosecurity as well. It will still not be possible to test every single food item that arrives in Australia, but as I said earlier, the Department of Agriculture has requested Food Standards Australia and New Zealand review the way they identified risk foods. It pays to remember that this is a regime that has served our country well until this incident. There are always risks associated with importing food across great distances, and that is what our border protection forces are trained to deal with. I support the work they do. Over 98% of all foods imported are declared clear of disease and other contaminants when they arrive in Australia, according to the imported food inspection data released by the Department of Agriculture. That is a very good pass rate, Mr Deputy Speaker. I believe that consumers can remain confident that the vast majority of imported foods are at the standard we expect. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, while I support the general thrust of this motion, as I did 4 years ago when the then Labor government rejected them, I must also admonish those opposite for failing to act when they were told by one of their own, Dr Neil Blewett, to do so. I support this motion in principle, but reject the cheap partisan politics that characterises this opposition. The coalition government has a good track record in this field, and it's time for Labor to get on board and stop putting politics ahead of the people of Australia.
I thank the member for Ryan.